Hello everyone, this is Mike Taylor. Welcome to the second episode of the Workplace Safety Review. I am the OSHA Practice Chair at Greenberg Traurig. I am located out of our Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia offices. Today, our guest speaker is Mike Hazen. Mike has been a good friend of mine for many, many years. We've done a lot of auditing together as well as other workplace safety and health type of work. So it's a pleasure and honor to have Mike with us today to talk about PSM, auditing, things like that, with COVID-19 occurring. Mike is a mechanical engineer with over 45 total years of experience in process safety, risk analysis, security, engineering, and plant operations. He has extensive experience in PSM/RMP programs, including leading many process hazard analysis, i.e. PHAs, and the development of mechanical integrity and other PSM/RMP management systems and procedures. Mike has led over 275 PSM/RMP audits since 1995, focusing mostly on the mechanical integrity aspect of auditing. Mike, welcome.
Thanks, Mike. Pleasure to be here.
Again, thanks for agreeing to be on the podcast. I know this is going to be a great experience. So now we have COVID-19. How has that been impacting some of your clients or your work dealing with auditing under PSM?
Well, clients whose triennial audit deadline date came due here in the spring of 2020 faced a unique set of circumstances because PSM RMP audits traditionally have been done face-to-face, and they generally have been done in a sort of a compressed one-week work schedule where you arrive on site early on Monday and you work almost feverishly until Friday. You have a closeout meeting, and then you go home and write your report. So the amount of time that the site was spending on the audit, aside from some prep time, was essentially force fit into that 1 week period. Well, because of travel restrictions and prohibitions in many companies against being face-to-face with third parties and people that are not company employees and these sorts of things, which are, of course, widespread throughout the economy. But what that did is, of course, cut us off from doing audits the way we would normally do them. Clearly, we can't be on site. And so how do you do an audit that's come due? Well, as you guys know, both OSHA and EPA have issued some notices here early in the COVID shutdown stage back in late March, early April, that sort of hinted at some flexibility with adhering to things like audit deadlines. But they wanted all the PSM and RMP community to look into alternate ways of accomplishing these required activities. Some of our clients, not all of them, but some of them have opted to try to do their audits remotely or virtually. And as we started to think about that, as we were approached by several of our clients who didn't want to defer their audit schedules, we thought about how you do a PSM audit and the basic things you do. And there's three basic sets of activities. You interview people, usually a fairly lengthy list of people during that 1 week period. You look at lots of records and documents, and you actually go out into the plant and look at a few things physically. Although in a PSM audit, that field work generally isn't quite as extensive as a general health and safety audit or maybe an environmental audit, but there's a little bit of it. And as we thought about that, we said, well, certainly we can interview people almost as easily on the phone or using telecommunication software like Blue Jeans that we're on right now, or Zoom, or one of the other ones. That's pretty easy to do. We can, and in fact, we can interview multiple people at the same time using those methods. Certainly, documents and records can be either sent to us, copies electronically can be sent to us for review, or using methods like Zoom and Blue Jeans, you can that have screen sharing capability. You can see them live. The only thing you can't do remotely or virtually, clearly, is go out into the plant and look at something physically. So as we step back and sort of plan how much of a PSM audit could we get done, it was pretty clear that we could get done about 90 or 95% of the things that we would have to do in a virtual or remote setting. So with a number of our clients, we have been doing audits like that, and they've actually been quite successful.
That is terrific. What would you say would be a con associated with doing these audits virtual, if you will?
Well, as I stated a minute ago, one of the things that when you do it face to face, it compresses the time that you have into that 1 week period. So everybody is geared up and ready, and when an auditor darkens your door and says that he's here to interview about this or that subject, that you have to set aside whatever else you're doing and pay attention to it and get it done. When you do it virtually or remotely, of course, that time pressure is removed. And that's an advantage in some cases because you have more flexibility to do a little bit now, do a little bit tomorrow, and then maybe take a couple of days off and come back to it. So you have a longer period of time to get everything done. But what it does is it removes the immediacy or the pressure to get it done during the 1 week period. So things tend to stretch out. And sometimes that you lose your efficiency. Once you get your audit, as you know, Mike, you've done this enough. Once you get your audit motor going, if you keep it going at the same rate, you start to do the work more efficiently. So stretching it out has some pros and cons, and we've experienced both of those.
Do you think that even after post-COVID, that this might be a trend that companies end up doing in terms of fulfilling their PSM obligations, i.e. a virtual audit as opposed to a face-to-face audit?
I think some of them will. That's entirely possible. Of course, it removes the need for any travel expenses, which is a plus. And it does allow for a little bit more flexibility in how and when you schedule the audit activities, which is for some people is a positive. But it does, by stretching it out, like I said, it does introduce some loss of efficiency. But I think a lot of companies will think about that once we're beyond the health crisis portion of this.
By doing the PSM audit virtually, I know you've been to a gazillion PSM covered facilities. But if you've never been to a particular facility and you're tasked with doing a PSM audit, particularly mechanical integrity, does it bother you or concern you that you're not able to look at the equipment at a particular site?
Well, being able to look at the equipment is always a plus. To actually work through most of our audit protocol questions, which are to a large degree programmatic. For example, in mechanical integrity, I focus mostly on the testing and inspection records and look at them to see if things are overdue or not, and to make sure that the thickness data for piping and pressure vessels and similar types of activities, it's collected right, analyzed right, and so forth. I don't actually need to look at the piping or the pressure vessel to draw those types of conclusions. But having the equipment at hand is sometimes an advantage. When reviewing things like repair records, those sorts of things, once in a while, certainly I will go out and actually physically confirm that the equipment physically agrees with what the records say. But most of what I can do or I have to do in a PSM RMP audit is mostly programmatic. So I don't need as much physical access to the equipment that, say, a safety and health auditor who is looking at a lot more physical kinds of things than a PSM auditor is.
Right, exactly. In terms of PSM and COVID-19, everyone knows that the gas prices have been plummeting of late, and the demand for gas is well below normal, right? How has that been impacting some of your clients in terms of operating safely, if you will, when the demand is so low?
Well, currently most oil refineries, and this just isn't in the United States, but globally, are operating at about 70 or 80% of their nameplate output capacity, plus or minus. Right now, gasoline demand globally is down by about 50%. Jet fuel demand is down even more. It's down by 70%. So only 30% of the normal demand is being consumed. Diesel fuel not as impacted because the trucking industry and the railroads are still operating at or near their normal rates. So the refineries are not able to sell a large part of their products. So if demand is down like to 50% for gasoline and by 70% for jet, but we're still producing at 70 to 80%, there's a gap of 20 or 30% there where we're producing more liquids, more fuels than the companies that make them are able to sell and distribute. That gap is starting to constipate many of these facilities. Their tank farms and their intermediate storage can handle that for a while, but they're getting pretty full. And I know that a few facilities are scrambling pretty hard to find off-site storage, say in the midstream or in the pipeline industry, where there's some other tankage that they can lease. So right now there's a fairly high inventory, higher than normal inventory of refined products, and of course it's those refined products that represent a fair amount of the process safety risk that's out there. So there's large inventories of material. The other way that reduced demand, it can affect at least an oil refinery, maybe more than other types of chemical and processing facilities, is that oil refineries are not designed to operate at very low output rates. Once they get below about 50% of their design output rate, they start to suffer instability problems, mostly with flow rates, rotating equipment operating at the edges of their performance curves, heat transfer rates start to get a bit unstable. The facilities are just not designed to operate at that low capacity. So if they can't go below 50% without suffering these instability problems, and the demand is even lower than that, then trying to force a facility to operate lower is a potential safety problem. So that's another issue that at least the refining sector is having to face. On a positive note, the petrochemical part of the industry, the petrochemical demand is actually higher than it has been recently, because the medical and health industry is, in order to produce very high volumes of personal protective equipment, masks and gloves and gowns and these sorts of things, plus all of the consumable materials that the health industry needs on a daily basis, tubing and all kinds of other things, the demand for petrochemicals is actually a little higher than for fuel. So a little bit of the higher demand can be made up there, but not enough to take up that roughly 50% demand that's missing.
Interesting. In terms of a refinery operating at half capacity, if maybe even less than that, you mentioned that there could be hiccups that could happen with temperatures and flows and pressures. So which ultimately, I think what you're saying is if they're operating at a low capacity for a certain period of time, you could have a lot of safety issues associated with that.
Facilities are just not designed to operate in that domain. So things, these stability problems that I referred to, when heat transfer rates start to go down, for example, then that means the temperature in one area of the plant, maybe other areas of the plant, is going to go up. And they may not, either the equipment is not able to deal with that or partially deal with that. And maybe even the operators and the other people are just not used to operating in that domain, and they may not have seen that before. So their ability to diagnose and respond to it may be a little slower. I haven't seen anything or heard anything of any serious incidents that have occurred because of these sorts of stability problems. But if these facilities are forced or they try to operate at those low rates, that kind of stuff could occur.
Interesting. What about one of the questions I was thinking about, wanted to ask you about, are refineries working at in terms of personnel? Some of your clients, are they scaled back in that sense, maybe working with like skeleton crews, or are they still operating full capacity with the number of employees that are there?
Well, the total number of employees, especially during day shift, which is normal under normal conditions, the time of the day when the population on site is highest, they have requested or required nearly everybody who can work remotely to do so. So that removes, at least from day shift, a fairly large part of the environmental health and support, safety support, the engineering support. Some of the maintenance people are just not on site. Now, most of those folks can do their jobs if they have a laptop computer and internet access from a remote location. But having all of their records available to them is, even electronically, is probably not happening. And it's certainly anything that's written on paper, they're not working on site. They're not going to be able to get at it if they need it. So even routine PSM things like the creation and routing and review and approval of MOCs may be harder to do. Things like that. Maintenance may be harder to do because they're operating with reduced maintenance workforce, just to keep the number of people on site as low as absolutely possible. Operations is not going to be as affected because you need a fixed number of people to safely operate PSM covered facilities. But I know in one or two cases, I know one client of ours, they're operating a medium-sized oil refinery with about 21, 22 operators. And just doing the arithmetic of how many units this plant has and how many operators that is, that's right at the edge, or maybe even a little less than being right at the edge of the normal operating workforce. So I know the facilities are trying to keep as few people on site at any given time as they can, and that's for health reasons, and clearly they're trying to prevent the spread of the virus. But not having the right people or the right expertise when you need it, it could be a potential problem. Again, I'm not aware of any incidents that have resulted because of that reduced manning, but it's a possibility.
Interesting. So that would also impact if you have a near miss or a catastrophic event, a facility being able to implement an emergency response to that incident if they're running on skeleton crews, correct?
That's correct. The most of the emergency response teams in the PSM community are made up of a few fully trained, fire protection professional type folks, but most of the emergency response team are volunteer responders taken mostly from the operating and maintenance workforces. They volunteer to serve on the emergency response team, and then they receive special training. So when a fire or an explosion or a release occurs, this sort of thing, the alarm sounds, and those folks stop their normal jobs and gear up and respond to the emergency situation. Hopefully, in most facilities, they still have enough people to fully man their emergency response teams as they normally would, without the COVID situation going on. All of those folks are on call, and they all have radios and cell phone communications. And on a normal night shift or a weekend, the virus notwithstanding, if they needed more help because of an emergency situation, they would put out the all call, and people would start rushing in. Well, I'm sure if something an emergency happened today, they would do the same thing, and they would live with the potential virus exposure in order to respond to an emergent situation.
Yeah, it's an interesting dichotomy, the virus and responding to a near miss or a catastrophic event, particularly when your crew, if your emergency response team is also working from home, if you will.
That's correct.
Yeah. What about any of your clients have what's called a turnaround? So for you listeners out there that may not know what that is, but oil refineries, for example, have what's called a turnaround, and every so often they empty out all their processes and they do maintenance and things like that, and then they start their refinery back up. To do the turnaround, they'll hire contractors and a GC to do the turnaround, do the maintenance work, and those people tend to come from elsewhere outside of the state of wherever the refinery is. Have any of your clients had to delay doing a turnaround, or has this been impacting turnarounds at all?
It has. Any facility that had a turnaround that was due here in the March, April, May timeframe that we're in right now had to defer that maintenance outage because the travel restrictions. They just for the largest facilities, you would have hundreds, even several thousand contractors on site, and as you noted, most of them come from out of state, not just out of the city or the town where the facility is located. So, airline travel being what it is, and the hotel industry and restaurants being closed, it's difficult to support hundreds or thousands of extra people in an area, in a concentrated area at any given time. So, those maintenance outages have been postponed. Also, a few facilities we're thinking about moving up some outages, but while the demand was lower, which seemed like a coincident kind of thing, but again, because of the travel restrictions, they just were not able to pull that off.
Interesting. Do you see if the shutdown, if you will, in the various cities and states continue much longer? And as you get out your crystal ball, let's say for a year from now, do you think that the shutdown in the PSM world and operating on skeleton crews, operating with skeleton crews and the low demand for gas, you think that's going to have an impact on the safety of refineries a year or 2 years down the road?
Well, most facilities will only be able to defer, say, an audit or a PHA or some activity that's required to be done in a PSM, or a vessel inspection or piping inspections, these sorts of things. They're only going to be able to defer those for so long, because eventually either the regulators will discover that and not react well to it. A little bit of time, a little bit of delay, while you arrange for a different contractor to inspect your pressure vessel, this sort of thing, they would probably be flexible about that. But widespread delays of many activities, probably would not be tolerated. Certainly, a major release, if it were to occur, would not be tolerated. I'm guessing. So doing this for a long period of time is probably going to be it's going to be almost untenable. They'll only be able to push off activities that are required for a short period of time, a year or something beyond a year, as you asked about. I'm not sure that's going to be possible to do. But I don't know. I mean, as time goes on here, we learn more about how to adapt businesses, how to adapt our healthcare systems, and all the rest. I don't know. Maybe the chemical processing, refining business will figure out a way to hold the risks where they are, or even lower, while still meeting whatever demand for their products is out there, without them making the risk go up. But it's going to be increasingly difficult. And all it takes is one really bad event, of course, and then, it's going to be a very difficult situation for everybody. And we've had that one event already, fortunately not in the United States, but the styrene release over in India that resulted in 11 fatalities occurred about a month ago. Certainly nobody wants anything like that occurring anywhere else in the world.
Indeed. Well, Mike, thank you for joining with us today and giving some insight on the PSM world during the COVID crisis. We really appreciate you taking your time out to talk with us today. Mike Hazen. Mike works for Acutech Consulting Group. And Mike, you're based out of Philadelphia area, right?
I am. Acutech has offices in the Philadelphia area. Our headquarters are in Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington. We also have an office in Houston and several offices overseas, India, Shanghai. So we're kind of spread out. Although we're a relatively small company, we're kind of spread out.
Lots of Marriott rewards points. Yeah, I hear you. Well, thanks, Mike. We really appreciate it. That wraps up the second episode of the Workplace Safety Review. Stay tuned for episode 3.
Thank you, Mike. My pleasure.